So I know it's been 2025 for a month now, but doesn't it kind of feel like we've all been trapped in the same year forever? No!
There we go. Hey everybody, it's Slazachoff. Today I'd like to talk about a video that I saw just yesterday and was so annoyed about, I just felt like I had to make a video in order to exercise this pestering little itch it left in my brain. As per the title, it covers a video that Adam Conover of Adam Ruins Everything fame released on his channel about 2 weeks ago. He made a video covering the phenomenon of the decades. He's going to lay out what he thinks made those so prominent in our culture and what he thinks happened to them. I'm going to play the video more or less minute by minute and just sort of interject with the problems that I have with some of the assertions he makes and some of the evidence that he uses to back up his claims.
We as a society have simply stopped dividing our cultural timeline into 10-year increments with discrete names. And I know that this is going to sound a little crazy.
Sorry, I paused. At a bad time.
Now look, before you say I'm just getting old, even posters on r/Gen Z think something weird is going on. So I've put a lot of thought into this, and I have a theory. I think it's because in the last 25 years, our culture has quietly experienced a huge linguistic shift that no one is talking about, but that has literally changed how we experience and remember the passage of time, and alienated us from each other and our own culture, all because the words we use to talk about time have changed.
So the basic premise for this video, what he's trying to communicate is that we, broadly defined, not really actually defined at all, it's pretty vague who the we is in this scenario, but for the most part we can say that he is experiencing a quickening of time. This is something that people generally experience as they get older, and that I feel like is an important point to highlight because he's going to highlight it himself and is going to say, I know it seems like maybe I'm just getting old.
Now look, before you say I'm just getting old,
but these people on the internet who claim to be from Generation Z, Gen Z, agree with me or sort of highlight a similar feeling, which isn't great evidence because that's also just a generation that's experiencing adulthood right now. I'm Gen Z myself. I'm 25 at this point. I do also feel like the passage of time is speeding up, but he claims that this is a result of a huge linguistic shift.
Our culture has quietly experienced a huge linguistic shift,
which caught my ear because I felt that that was a kind of an odd explanation. I feel like there are a lot of factors in society that are probably more likely the cause, but I was interested to hear what he thought this huge linguistic shift we were all quietly experiencing was.
So I want you to think for a second about how you talk about time these days, how you describe the era that we live in. You might call it the post-pandemic era, or maybe the second Trump administration. Or, as I overheard someone say in LA recently, you might say we're entering our fire era. Bleak. But you know, we used to have a different way to talk about the passage of time that was pervasive in our society.
So what he posits is that the way we talk about time, again, we is not defined here. We have been talking about time differently. And what he sets up here is the concept of the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s. These 10-year intervals are actually what used to be a very consistent metric of time that we would be able to reference when we are trying to discuss popular culture. That's not incorrect by any means at all. I don't disagree with that. That was very predominant in the 20th century and is still here today. I want to highlight that.
But then, 10 years later, something happened that made the vibes suddenly stop shifting. See, in English, we have words for the numbers from 20 to 29, 30 through 39, all the way up through 90 to 99, 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. But we don't actually have a word for the two groups of numbers that precede them, 0 through 9 and 10 through 19. So when the clock turned from December 31st, 1999 to January 1st, 2000, we found ourselves in a new decade that we just didn't have a good name for. We just started calling the decade nothing. We didn't say, welcome to the Aughties. We didn't say, welcome to the anything. We all just stopped talking about the decade entirely.
But we don't really have as catchy a way to refer to the 2000s or the 2010s or the 2020s, except I feel like he's missing the fact that we absolutely do. I just did it. I just compared the 80s and the 90s to the 2000s and the 2010s and the 2020s, and those aren't necessarily as short a phrase as the 90s and 80s and all these two-syllable words, but that doesn't really change the fact that we have the words available to us in our language. So he's going to make a point that sort of obscures this phenomenon that we absolutely have an ability to talk about the decades still, and he's going to say that it's been largely replaced by things like post-pandemic era, second Trump era, post 9/11 era, which isn't incorrect. Those just also sit on the side of how we talk about the decades as a cultural metric unit.
The bundle of concepts associated with each decade feels so distinct and meaningful that just the name of a decade evokes a world of associations with that time period. And up until the late 90s, we used these decade names almost constantly in everyday speech to describe not just the past, but the present.
Wake up and smell the 90s.
Come on, Uncle Phil, this is the 90s, man.
Man, it's the 90s. It's hammer time. Come on.
I can be anything I want to be. It's the 90s.
Honey, it's the 90s, remember? Microchips, microwaves, faxes, airphones.
For God's sake, Chucky, drag yourself into the 90s.
I mean, the 90s were such an enormous, omnipresent concept that even sentient axe-murdering dolls understood they had to get with the times.
Oh, so he highlights this usage of we're in the 90s now, that was so popular in 90s pop culture, television, and film, as being a meditation on how the old norms were being thrown out for the new. What I think is really important to highlight, though, is that right about at the end of the 90s, 2001 to be specific, there was a great big event in American history that might have challenged the idea that the old world was left behind. I'm trying to think about what that might have been. Something that would really, shake the American sense of identity and progress to its very core. There was like a lot of push-ups and jumping jacks I had to do about it. First of all, we do have terms for it. He lists them out as being things like the aughts, which is what I use, generally speaking. The aughts, double zeros, the naughties, and the early 2000s. And he puts down the usage of the early 2000s as being clunky and not as fun to say.
And the 2010s doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. Neither does the early 2000s. It's missing that bouncy 80s, 90s, 70s quality. It's just not fucking fun to say, so we didn't say it that much.
Which is a real quote. He says it's not as fun to say, and so we just didn't say it. We just didn't use it, which is patently absurd. We just didn't talk about the decade we were in at the time because we didn't have a nice little cinched name for it. We didn't have a quick little snappy little name for it.
The aughts, the double zeros, and even the naughties. That last one probably didn't catch on because it wasn't exactly a naughty time. America was so conservative in those days, people were literally wearing dresses over pants.
Very important to this is you remember this picture of Lindsay Lohan in a pseudo leopard print skirt. It's bespeckled in black and kind of resembles leopard print, right? Over top jeans, a sort of baggy, not really formed to her leg jeans. A very distinctly 2000s style of fashion that he highlights as culturally this was only existing within the 2000s. He highlights this. So I want you to keep that in mind and burn this image of Lindsay Lohan into your retinas because he's going to make a point later that is contradictory to what he sets up himself right here.
So instead of settling on any of those names, we just started calling the decade nothing. We didn't say, welcome to the Audies. We didn't say, welcome to the anything. We all just stopped talking about the decade entirely. Then, 10 years later, once we entered the 2010s, once again, we simply could not find a good name to use. I mean, sure, 2013 through 2019 could technically be called the teens, but not 2010, 11, or 12.
Once we entered the 2010s, we could not find a good name to use. It's called the 2010s. Real big thing here is that mass communication technology was really only predominant in American culture around the 1920s. Mass communication technology was being developed near the turn of the 20th century. Audio recordings being developed around the same time, radio being very popular around the 1920s. It's the reason you can think of the 1920s sound to begin with, is because that is when it became popular culture. Otherwise, it would have been a very niche thing to New York, and so it wouldn't have been widely spread and associated with that time period. Just the fact that we have 20 in front of 10s now, I guess, eliminates it as being a valid candidate for the name of the decade, even though that is what absolutely everyone and anybody would readily call it. It's such a poorly thought out point. I can't believe he would put up the video like this. He's supposed to be a guy who elaborates on cultural phenomenon and explains it to the general public. He's missing the point, or he's trying to purposely obscure the point. It's so frustrating.
Meaning that once again, the decade went by without it ever receiving a widespread popular name. But then, at long last, 5 years ago, it became 2020. Finally, a year with a good decade name. But by then, it had been so long since we talked in decades, the muscle had atrophied, and we just never started doing it.
The use of that, the muscle atrophied, it's very illuminating, isn't it? I mean, maybe your muscle had atrophied, but people are still growing up. There's still youth culture being developed today. There's still children who are developing culture, and that's what is happening now. He isn't really a part of it. I'm not really a part of it myself anymore, but it exists still. The children are still making things, and the decades are still very much being referred to as decades.
I mean, we are literally halfway through the 20s right now. Have you heard anybody call this decade the 20s? No!
Well, yes. First of all, yeah.
No! In fact, when I say the 20s, you think of the 1920s. You're not picturing Cybertrucks and Sabrina Carpenter. You're thinking about flappers doing the foxtrot with F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yeah, we say the 2020s now, because if we say the 20s, that already exists in the collective imagination as being the 1920s, again, because that's when radio was popularized, so it already has a place in the cultural imagination, so we have a new term now to refer to the current period as the 2020s. I mean, we still say it as the 20s because contextually, you're able to parse what somebody means. If you're talking about any new form of technology, you're talking about 2020s. If you're doing a kind of historical report, or you really need to be specific, you say the 1920s. And the fact that he feels that there's so much power in lobbing off that small piece of information, which can be gathered back through contextual reading anyway, it blows my mind, because this is a guy who had a television show where he explained things to people and treated it like it was really painful. And I feel like that says more about him than anybody else. So yeah, I have heard people refer to it as the 20s. So it's a bad point. It's a poorly thought out point. Maybe just a poorly researched point, which is really funny because in the middle of this video, he talks about his sponsor being Ground News that he relies on for providing him the ability to research these topics.
If you don't believe me, just check out our sponsor, Ground.
I don't know if that demonstrates a lack of his inability to utilize research, or if that kind of highlights Ground News as a bad service. I haven't used it myself, but if this guy is telling you that you ought to use it for research and this is what he's doing with it, maybe you ought to hold off on that subscription.
We as a society have simply stopped dividing our cultural timeline into 10-year increments with discrete names. And I know that this is going to sound a little crazy,
Sorry, I paused at a bad time. I'll unpause now.
But I think that has made it seem like time is blending together because we've lost our ability to describe in a clear shorthand way how it's changing. Okay, like here's an example. If your friend threw a 90s party, you'd know to dress up like MC.
Oh, God. So when I was first watching this video, up to this point, I wasn't with him exactly, but I was still wanting to hear him out. But this point frustrated me enough to the point that I think this was the first time I thought maybe I have to say something, because this is absurd. I'll just let him lay out his point, and you be the judge. Honestly, you think about this. The point that he's about to make, the holes make themselves. Like the holes in his argument form almost like Swiss cheese. It's like natural to the process.
Okay, like here's an example. If your friend threw a 90s party, you'd know to dress up like MC Hammer or Blossom or the Chief from Carmen Sandiego. But if they threw a party set in 2012, what would you wear? A trucker hat, a collared shirt, the concept of Barack Obama? Fashion doesn't really feel like it's changed as much in the past 20 years.
Fashion, I really don't, because
No!
So his conception of what would have been fashionable in 2012 is obviously reflective of what he would have been experiencing at the time. He lists trucker hats, collared polos, and the concept of Barack Obama, which, first of all, if you were trying to dress up as Barack Obama, tan suit, kind of obvious, kind of the go-to. I don't know how that one misses him as somebody who claims to be politically literate.
If you don't believe me, just check out our sponsor, Ground.
Kind of just right over the head.
Fashion doesn't really feel like it's changed as much in the past 20 years.
2012 fashion is so distinct. It's so distinct in my mind, in anybody's mind who would have been growing up at the time, anybody who would have been aware of youth culture at the time, emo punk, mall goth, scenester, anything that would have been going on in youth culture in 2012 is what you would associate with the time period. I mean, he even lists collared polos, like neon polo, the neon swag bro polo thing, hugely popular. Yeah, a distinct trend in the 2010s. I think he wants to argue this point so much, he's deliberately obfuscating the reality of the situation, because I can't imagine that somebody would be so blind to the fact that he wouldn't have been defining what was popular then. It would have been younger people. It would have been the thing you probably thought was dumb at the time and doesn't exist anymore, because that is what youth culture is. Sorry to say, guys, if you're a kid now, go all out. Express yourself how you want. Just know that in like 10 years, you're going to look at it and go, oh, well, that looks a little silly. Who cares? That's the fun part. That's the fun part of being young, is you get to do all these weird things with your friends and stuff, and then you get to laugh about it later. Ugh, just don't think that like the 90s were a better time because fashion was more prevalent or something. It caters to this worldview that like the past, the time in which I was a kid, was so much better. And now that I'm watching millennials go through that same sort of cycle, it makes me worried about my generation, the generations to come. Like, people are just going to keep making these claims that, like, nowadays, it's just not the same, bro. And you just got to chalk it up to growing, aging. Happens. It happens. It'll happen. Get over it.
No! Fashion doesn't really feel like it's changed as much in the past 20 years. I mean, look at the clothes from The Office. Sure, the colors are a little dorky maybe, but if you wore them today, you wouldn't look like you stepped out of a time machine. But in the late 90s, people thought the fashion choices of just a decade earlier looked insane.
Okay, so you remember that one image that I asked you to burn into your retinas of Lindsay Lohan? That's going to come back now, because the choice that he makes, and this is why I think he's purposefully making bad points just to facilitate his argument. The choice that he makes to use The Office as like the cultural barometer for what people would have been wearing at the time instead of that Lindsay Lohan picture that he used to describe fashion at that same period of time is just so contradictory. I need to take a break because this is so annoying. This is just so aggravating. The Office is a show about how in corporate environments you are not allowed to express your true self in order to fit a mandated code of conduct. That's the whole premise. That's what makes the show work. It's a mockumentary of how stifling an office environment can be to regular people, and that was like the main thrust of the entire concept of The Office. It was hugely popular because it lampooned all the weird workarounds that you have to do in a corporate environment in order to like be a human being. It's why it feels so real at times when people kind of act out. Michael Scott is this character that people love because he's a man-child in a very adult environment, and that bleeds through because he's not allowed to express his true self, and that's reflected in the clothing that you have to wear in a corporate environment. So to use that as like the reference for what would have been fashion at the time is just, it's purposefully making a bad point in order to make your argument look better. And I don't know how many times I'm going to have to say that. Just look at Jesse Pinkman in 2008, The Office. Or not The Office, Breaking Bad. Jesse Pinkman in The Office would have been good. I think there was a crossover that one time. Always Sunny. Early Always Sunny episodes. Dude, the way Dennis was dressing, super applicable to that period of time. You can list any number of examples. They would all be better than The Office. Because The Office was drawing the point by having people... Oh my God.
But in the late 90s, people thought the fashion choices of just a decade earlier looked insane. Like, okay, think of the movie The Wedding Singer. This movie came out in 1998, and the entire premise of the movie is making fun of how crazy fashion and culture were in 1985, just 13 years earlier. The suits, the hair, the music. But that time difference is less than the chronological distance between us and The Office. Yet the cultural distance feels much greater.
Okay, so this part is I had to start doing research kind of beginning around here because I really wanted to start making my points clearer. The phenomenon of creating movies around really weak premises, let's be honest, was very fashionable around this period of time, around the late 90s, early 2000s. That's why you have things like the Jerky Boys movie. I know nobody my age or younger knows what that is. What do you even define them as? They were like a group of guys who would prank call people and just annoy the shit out of them. And that was it, pretty much. I mean, it's not high art, but, that's what happens every once in a while. There are people that do that now on TikTok and YouTube. Like, you just prank call people, and it's funny. It's a little entertaining thing. Well, the Jerky Boys were just a really popular group of guys who did exactly that. They made a movie out of that. They prank call people, and I think they get in trouble with the mafia. Pretty weak premise.
Our Lady of Sorrows front desk.
Oh, I got hemorrhoids bad. My hiney's killing.
People heard we were making a movie. They were in shock saying, what the hell's the movie going to be about?
Well, you guys got to do my camp. Hit me over the head.
The Wedding Singer, it's all about making fun of fashion in the 80s. A Scary Movie was all about making fun of trends at the time. It famously has, I think the second Scary Movie famously has a reference to like Nike ads that were really only popular around the 2000s. And so if you didn't see those commercials, you wouldn't get the reference now. Really important to my point here is that this trend of movies based on really weak premises doesn't really exist anymore. At least it's not very popular anymore. What would be more popular now to comment on the fashion and the culture of just a decade prior are memes. He was a kid in the time when TV and movies were the most popular and widespread form of mass media technology around. Now, kids are growing up with the internet. I grew up with the internet. And so the method of communication and the means by which we would make fun of earlier decades has radically changed. You wouldn't really see a movie that's all about making fun of the stuff that was happening in 2012. Like, you would probably be able to find something like that, but it wouldn't be as popular because people on the internet already do that all the time. Like, there's this one joke that stays with me forever, and I actually ended up finding it in order to reference it. In 2007, if you wore a long sleeve t-shirt under a regular t-shirt, it meant that you liked music. And that was like a real choice in fashion, and it didn't communicate a whole lot other than you were just vaguely kind of artsy. And if you didn't grow up then, I understand like this kind of doesn't have the same effect or appeal to you, but I can tell you that this is funny because of how accurate it is. This is how we would comment on trends of a previous era. It's right here in front of us. This is how we do it. So the fact that it just doesn't exist in a movie form and is therefore not valid as a cultural criticism, to me says a lot about where he's actually pulling his research from.
Just check out our sponsor, Ground. I mean, imagine if they made a movie today about 13 years ago. What exactly would be different? I mean, Taylor Swift was still on the radio. Suits for Women were in. Guess what? They still are. Our iPhones today are a little bigger. Who gives a shit? And in 2012, gas prices were rising and politicians were arguing about the Affordable Care Act. The same shit we're arguing about right now. If you don't believe me, just check out our sponsor, Ground.
So right now he's choosing another bad example to use. He says that 13 years ago, as of today in 2025, we wouldn't see a big difference in culture, again, which is just absurd. And he lists things like Taylor Swift is still on the radio. Taylor Swift being on the radio is like the one example of what you could say is the same between now and then, because Coldplay isn't really a thing. Avicii passed away a while ago, and so he's no longer in the cultural consciousness. Skrillex isn't a thing. Just the amount of music examples you could have gone with versus what you actually went with, it makes it very clear that you were just trying to make a point that wasn't accurate to reality. Also, he says our phones are a little bigger, who gives a shit?
Our iPhones today are a little bigger, who gives a shit?
Buddy, what happened inside of the phones is kind of the cultural thing, actually. It's not the phone itself. He is a guy who, at this point in time, could largely do what he does for a living on the internet through his phone. That didn't really exist in 2012. YouTube was around then and very popular, but the concept of being a full-time content creator, that really wasn't even a thing. I don't think content creator was the term we would have used back then. It would have probably just been like online entertainer or just YouTuber. Those are terms that we don't use anymore because content creator is a thing now. It's a thing that Adam Conover does. Totally possible to make a living through your phone now. Not really applicable 13 years ago. So the analysis that he makes about the phone itself being bigger, purposely missing the point. Purposely missing the point again.
So I want to be clear. I'm not arguing that our abandonment of decade names caused the nature of time to change or made our culture stop evolving. Obviously, it has continued to. But because the decade names functioned as a way to socially agree on what had changed and as a shorthand way to describe what those changes looked like, losing them has interfered with our ability to communicate and therefore identify what has changed over the passage of time. And, that's just my own analysis, but there is some linguistic science to back up the idea that words have a huge impact on the way we think about the world and about time itself.
All right, so this was the moment my ears perked up, because if you don't know, many of you probably are already aware, linguistics is my forte. Let's say that. I studied it at university. Him pulling up research, I thought was interesting because what he's trying to make out of this whole argument is couched in a very, let's just say controversial area of linguistic discussion in the modern day. I need to take a break. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to go and take a break.
So there's this fascinating study that was recently profiled in the New Yorker. In the study, English speakers' ability to describe smells was compared to people who speak Jahai, a language spoken by hunter-gatherers living on the border of Malaysia and Thailand. Now, unlike English, Jahai has lots of unique, specific words for different kinds of smells and the sense impressions that they make. And during the study, people who spoke Jahai were able to name and identify new smells they had never encountered before much more quickly than English speakers. Their noses aren't different from English speakers, but their words are. And because they had the words to describe smells, they literally perceived them more clearly.
So this is a really poor use of the science that he is referencing here. I've gone and read the New Yorker article, and I actually went and got the paper that it was talking about originally, and I've read and digested both. Now, the study that this is referencing is being done by two linguists, Byrne, Holt, and Majid. They decided to test this theory that has been prevailing throughout the centuries, that odor is a uniquely difficult thing to communicate in language. And it was for a long time thought to be nearly impossible to accurately represent through just simple language the sensation of smell. Now, obviously, that comes from a very Western worldview, and new studies are being done to examine where people actually have the vocabulary developed in order to discuss these smells with a finer differentiation between them. This study is coming from a field of thought that is relatively new to linguistics called Neo-Worfianism. The history here is that in the 1930s, there was a man named Worf, Benjamin Worf, who had been doing some minor tinkering with a language called Hopi, the Native American language, and noticed that they have a sort of circular sense of time, which can be analyzed in the way that they discuss it in their language. Like terms referencing time in the Hopi language use this spatial metaphor that he recognized as being kind of circular, and thought that that was highlighting a particular thing that was happening in the Hopi brain, reflecting how they perceived time. Now, the problem with Worfianism was that that was extrapolated to then say, depending on what your native language is, that will concretely and for the rest of your life define how you are able to perceive reality. And if you don't have a language that is advanced enough, it's a very contentious topic here, you will be less able to perceive reality accurately. That's really the big problem that people have had with Worfianism, with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as it became known. Neo-Worfianism is looking at all of that, but like holding back on some of the assumptions that were being made by the original analysis. The spatial concept of time is still very prevalent in discussions, but we no longer say that it is a concrete way of kind of harnessing and capturing your ability to perceive things around you. It kind of more so guides what you might use spatially or, as a metaphor to represent time. Now, the example that he uses, because it's in the New Yorker article and is actually in the study itself, is that in English, we largely see time as being split up into the future and the past. The future is ahead of us, and the past is behind us. What happened in the past, it's behind us now. We're moving forward into the future. These are spatial metaphors, which are unique to English, not really a universal concept, though. In language groups like the Aymara speak, their language of Aymara, the reverse is true. They actually think of time in that same future and past distinction, but the past is what is in front of them, because it is what is known. It is what can be seen in front of them. And so because the past is known and can be analyzed, it's right here in front of us. And the distant past is a bit further back, because that's a little harder to see, a little harder to remember, and so a little less understood. The future is behind in the Aymara language because it can't be known. It's obscured to us, and wherever you're facing forward, you can't also know what's behind you. It's a fascinating concept, but the problem is that it is very easily tooled into a weapon against anybody who doesn't speak X language. It really could be used against any group, but for the most part, it was used against non-Western cultures and languages to describe them as lesser than. Again, nobody likes Worfianism. We were trying to move past this in linguistics for a long time, and so that's why the developments have created this new school of thought called Neo-Worfianism. That is what the point of this study is to kind of analyze the distinctions that we make in the vocabulary that's available to us versus another language group. In Jahai, there is a uniquely diverse category of abstract language used for recognizing odors. In English, we have a number of ways of talking about the smell of something. We usually say it maybe smells like cinnamon, or it smells like lemon. It smells like X, Y, and Z. The thing is, those are not abstract terms, which is what's prevalent in Jahai. They have a lot of abstract terms. In English, when we're saying it's like cinnamon, it's like sweet, it's savory, we're referencing something that already exists. So a lot of the time, when you ask somebody to describe a smell, they say it smells like cookies, or it smells sweet. It smells in these kind of referential ways, but the abstract terminology isn't super fleshed out in the English language. That's what's unique to Jahai, and that's what this study was looking to analyze, was whether or not English speakers could match up to Jahai speakers in terms of how accurately they were able to describe the sensation of smell. Now, that's fascinating research, obviously. It was a great read, and I recommend anybody else get a hold of this study if they are interested in understanding further what's actually happening here, because he is not utilizing the research accurately. They are not trying to highlight the Jahai speakers as better at perceiving smell than English speakers. That is a school of thought that belongs to Worfianism, which, as I highlighted before, not a good route to go down. It very, very quickly proceeds into scientific racism. However, that's exactly the point that Adam Conover is trying to make here, that the speakers of Jahai were better perceivers of odor than the English speakers. Patently false. Absolutely false. Undermines the very thing that the study is trying to get at, and he is misusing that information, misapplying it to a completely irrelevant point about decades not having names anymore, because they do, and also the perception of things without a word being described that's not how it works. We can perceive a lot of things without being able to necessarily translate that into a very easy word.
We're beginning to understand that the words we have available to us to describe the world around us do help shape the way we understand and think about the world. And that's another reason why the loss of decades is a problem, because we didn't just lose the concept, we replaced it with something much worse. Because you know what has replaced decades in everyday speech? Generations. In the last 20 years, generational language and concepts have exploded in popular culture, and as far as I can tell, that has replaced decades in the cultural imagination. For instance, when we talk about fashion for the past 20 years, we don't talk about Audie's fashion. Instead, we call it millennial fashion and Gen Z fashion, and I think that's a problem.
So this is the trajectory that this argument is going towards, is that the loss of decades is actually a problem. He feels that in absence of a clear term for the decades, which there is no absence, but he perceives an absence, there is instead now a conversation around the generation you belong to having a bigger cultural impact on your person than your experience of a decade. Since he's a millennial, I can understand why he feels that this is a problem. Oftentimes, you would see X industry is being ruined because the millennials are changing their trends towards shopping. That was a very prominent thing a couple years ago, 10 years ago, however long it was, to blame millennials, and distinctly the category of millennial, as a kind of person who culturally is different from the rest of society. Since generational discussions really kind of became most popular around the turn of the century, largely because millennials were adopting the internet before the older generations, they faced a lot of the initial backlash towards this stuff. Millennials get a bad rap a lot of the time. It's very easy to shit on them because they've done, whatever cringy thing. They have their good things to highlight as well, but it really shouldn't even need to be said that, yeah, it's kind of absurd to group a whole generation of people together under one umbrella. It didn't replace the decade talk. It really only applies to millennials, unfortunately. Gen Z, I don't think, has this same attitude towards generations. Hopefully they don't. I might be out of the know there. Honestly, I don't engage in any of this generational talk because I don't feel it's prevalent to our society either, or at least it's not very prevalent to me and my experience here. That's an individual thing. It's going to be an individual basis on whether or not you even care about generations. So to highlight this as like a problem in society, it's maybe really just a problem for you. Honestly, you and your group who you define as we. It's nobody's fault exactly. So sorry, millennials, but that's just how it goes. There are so many examples of things you could be highlighting that are positive, but this video only really works if you highlight the negatives. And I feel like that's because he is so wrapped up in the negatives that they're kind of the only thing that really sticks around. They're the most pervasive thing on the internet, negativity. But that's a perception problem unique to you and to your in-group. So it's very clear this is an insecurity of his and in his in-group, which is fine. But to try and make it out to be a problem and to say that the 90s were better than the modern day is falling into that same paradigm we always see of, when I was a kid, things were so much better. It's going to happen to everybody at some point, but you got to try and recognize that times change. Things are a-changing. There's nothing you can really do about it besides just avoid the negativity.
What I hate most about generational language is that it divides us. It only talks about how we're different as people, like there's some huge gap between us. But when we talk about decades, we're talking about a shared experience that we all lived through together, regardless of what age we are. It's a uniting experience. Whether you were 9 or 89, if you lived through the 70s, you were staying alive with the Bee Gees and rocking ugly new polyester clothes. And then 10 years later, you got to throw all that in the trash and make fun of it with your friends, no matter how old they were.
Okay, I think it's interesting that he wants to bring back the concept of the decade because he feels that it's unifying with the culture. So he doesn't feel unified with modern culture. I think that's largely because the internet has mostly decentralized the way that we experience culture. But the reason that the 70s would have looked like the 70s on television and movies is because it was being controlled by a handful of executives out in Hollywood or in these news agencies, maybe even certain parts of the federal government, a very kind of close-knit group of people who had control over the media landscape for a long time, were able to sell trendy clothing and control the whims of the trends that were popular at the time because they controlled the means to sell these things. Advertisers were trying to sell commercial spots on TV. They were paying a lot of money to do so. Nowadays, as he himself exemplifies, advertisers are moving to the internet. Ground News is paying him to advertise their services, which I might remind you is also just a centralization of all the decentralized news outlets available on the internet.
So you know what I think we should do? This is my formal petition to bring back decades. Decade names were good things. They were helpful to us because they helped foster a shared understanding of what we went through together, of the communal experiences we all had. So let me be the first to say, Welcome to the 20s, motherfuckers. Yeah, we're 5 years late, but guess what? We've still got 5 more years to figure out what the hell they were about. And maybe these 20s won't roar quite as much as the last centuries. But at least, if we call them that, it'll be a decade that belongs to all of us.
Finishing it off with a reference to the decade belonging to all of us is really interesting because, just being honest, it doesn't belong to certain age groups anymore. The decade of any period of time is largely going to be defined by the youth of that time. If you're not with what the youth are doing, you're not going to recognize it for what it really is. The 20s are already here, so unfortunately, it doesn't belong to all of us, and that's okay. You get to have what you have that's unique to you, and you can feel how you want about youth culture in the modern day. You can love it or you can hate it. It is what it is. The answer to the question, what happened to the decades, is nothing. You just got old. Yeah, so that's it. That's the video. Again, I just want to highlight, I don't have anything against millennials. I know a bunch of you guys, and you're all cool. It's just, if you're gonna try and say that the past is better, you gotta really come really swinging. You can't use science wrong and make bad points and then draw out evidence that highlights how you're arguing from an emotional standpoint and purposely missing the point. So, yeah, take care of yourselves, enjoy culture in the modern day, and just live your lives. Do what you want to do, especially if you're young. Express yourself, do anything that comes to mind artistically, because who knows? Maybe you'll be the reason that the next trend happens. That's just how it works now. It's pretty cool, I think. So, yeah, that's it. Bye.